there's no question that meditation changes the brain. And then here we're talking about both the function and the structure of the brain. There's no question. Meditation does change the brain, and there is overwhelming evidence for that. Structural changes like increases in gray matter in specific regions of the brain with short amounts of meditation, the evidence has really not held up. The effects that have been reported are opposite to what we might expect.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dharma Lab. I am Cortland Dahl. I'm here with Richie Davidson, one of the pioneering neuroscientists that is led the way in helping us understand the relationship between the mind, the brain, emotions, and especially how we can train ourselves to flourish. So today we are going to get a little taste of one of the most important scientific questions around this whole field of research, which is whether meditation really changes the brain. And when I think about my life, Richie, just to kind of link this up to personal experience, I can think of things where there is a very clear before and after when it comes to meditation. So one thing I've shared many times here in Dharma Lab and elsewhere is that when I started meditating more than 30 years ago, I had a genuine phobia of public speaking, like a really severe phobia of public speaking. And now, years later, not only do I not get anxious public speaking, I truly enjoy it. And even with some of the, measuring some of my biometrics, like I have this Aura ring. We're not sponsored by Aura ring, just for the record. But I wear this thing and it measures my biometrics, things like heart rate variability and my heart rate. And actually my physiology, as measured by this, actually goes into a deeply relaxed state when I am in front of a crowd or giving a public talk, which would have been unthinkable 20, 30 years ago. So whether or not my brain has changed, I would imagine that it has. It's hard to imagine that deep a change would happen without my brain changing at all. But it relates to this question in scientific research and some of the headlines that we see sometimes that mindfulness changes your brain. And then a new study comes out and it's like, oops, actually mindfulness doesn't change your brain. And even what we mean by changing your brain, because of course you can speak to this. Does that mean the way your brain is functioning? Does it mean the actual wiring of your brain, like the physical structure of your brain? So why don't I just turn this over to you, Richie? You've done some of the most important work in this area. And it's one of these things that I feel like the headlines miss the nuance and it can be easily misunderstood. So why don't we, however you want to kick this off, and then we can dive into some of the interesting points.
Thank you, Cort. And you really set this up beautifully in the last little piece of your opening introduction, where you distinguish between what we call the functional changes in the brain, changes in how the brain is functioning. That may be expressed as differences in activation patterns in different parts of the brain, versus changes in the, quote, wiring of the brain, or changes in the amount of gray matter. Gray matter are the cell bodies of neurons that show up as gray matter on an MRI scan when you do that. And white matter, just sort of a little parentheses, white matter reflect the axons that connect one region of the brain to another. So both of those are different measures of what we call structural changes in the brain that literally refer to the physical structure, the physical characteristics of the brain. So it's possible to have the brain change in terms of its function without any changes in structure. If there are changes in structure, it almost always implies that there's also going to be a change in function. So those are just some important issues to clarify at the outset. And one of the things that got the field really excited is that very early on, many, many years ago, 20 years ago, there were a couple of reports suggesting that among people who are just beginning to meditate and who took 1 2 month course in mindfulness based stress reduction, which is a very widely available method that we've talked about before in Dharma Lab. In fact, we've had John Kabat-Zinn with us, who was the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction in the late 1970s. And it's a 2 month, once a week course in mostly awareness practices. It also includes some physical activity like a little bit of yoga. And there is home practice that's prescribed as well. And it's a total of somewhere between 24 and 30 hours of total practice over the course of the 2 months. And these reports in the early 2000s were reports of changes in the amount of gray matter in places like the prefrontal cortex. And they're big news headlines, grow your prefrontal cortex with meditation.
And could you
Um,
just say briefly what would be the benefit? Why would you want to grow your prefrontal cortex? Just so people understand the role that the prefrontal cortex plays just in everyday life, or why this would be beneficial.
yeah, that's an important question. The prefrontal cortex is the primary site of what we think of as the central executive network, the network in the brain that is responsible for goal-directed behavior. So, for example, if you are sitting at home and you realize that you need to go do some grocery shopping and you mentally plan to get in your car and you make a to-do list of the things you need to buy at the grocery store, and then you go in your car, you go drive to the store and buy that stuff. All of that is navigated importantly by the prefrontal cortex. You are planning for some future activity and you're directing and harnessing the resources in your brain to accomplish that goal.
And
Um,
equally, things like forming a healthy habit or letting go of a bad habit, you have a clear vision of what you want to do, and then you need to be monitoring your behavior and making sure you're on track or avoiding things like that. All depends on having a healthy central executive network.
Exactly. And also voluntarily regulating your attention.
Hmm.
So deciding that I'm going to attend to this and not attend to that is something that is at least in part regulated by the prefrontal cortex. So it has all these, very important and adaptive functions. Also, it's got some, it gets in the way at times as well. And that's a whole other story. And we've talked about that in previous episodes of Dharma Lab, but the extraordinary capacities for which the prefrontal cortex enables us, it also can cause an enormous amount of suffering. And so it is responsible for having us not be in the present moment, so to speak. So we can be engaged in an activity and at the same time, we can be worrying about the future or ruminating about the past. And those abilities are conferred by the prefrontal cortex.
Hmm.
Um, and, I've mentioned this before, but just to remind viewers, there's a very famous book that was written by a very famous neurobiologist named Robert Sapolsky, who's a professor at Stanford. And he wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it's a great title. And basically, the reason why zebras don't get ulcers is because they have a very puny prefrontal cortex. They don't worry about the future or ruminate about the past because they don't have the biological machinery that enables them to do that. So, in some sense, they're much more living in the present moment. They don't get ulcers because of that. Humans do. So, that's all a big parentheses. So let's get back to the evidence. And there were these early studies that suggested that a short amount of meditation results in changes in the size, literally the volume that can be measured on an MRI scan of the prefrontal cortex. And a bunch of other studies followed. And and then there was a meta-analysis actually that was published in 2023 that summarized the evidence on mindfulness-based stress reduction. And the meta-analysis claimed that there were these structural changes in the brain in largely in areas of the central executive network. And so where does that evidence sit now? First of all, the editors, and the meta-analysis was published in Scientific Reports in 2023. I believe it was 2025 that the editors themselves of the journal retracted the paper against the advice of the authors. Usually when a scientific paper is retracted, it's retracted by the authors in light of new evidence. This was actually retracted by the editors, which is kind of extraordinary. But it was retracted by the editors because the authors of the paper omitted some important data in that meta-analysis. And if you include that data in the meta-analysis, the effects disappear. So in addition, in 2022, our group published a paper in a very high-profile scientific journal, Science Advances, and we reported no structural differences between mindfulness-based stress reduction and both an active control as well as a weightless control in a 3-arm randomized controlled trial. So in terms of the structural changes like increases in gray matter in specific regions of the brain with short amounts of meditation, the evidence has really not held up. Moreover, and this is a finding out there in the literature that still doesn't really have a good explanation, although there might be some interesting speculations about this. There have been some reports looking at the relationship between the length of practice and the magnitude of structural changes, and the effects that have been reported are opposite to what we might expect, which is the more meditation you do, the less the structural changes in the brain. Now, in some sense, when you think about it, if the finding is increased gray matter in a specific region of the brain, if you thought that there was a linear relation, so the more meditation you did, the more and more gray matter in this particular area, I mean, it strains credulity to believe that, because that would be like phrenology. There would eventually be like a bump in the head that would be protruding if there were really increases in gray matter that were linearly related to the amount of meditation you did. It just doesn't make any sense. Also, from the understanding of expertise from other literature, and in fact, there's a paper that we're co-authoring with one of our colleagues, Leandro Chernikov, who is one of the founders of Atentamente in Mexico, on a skill-based model for, and Cort and I are both co-authors of this paper. And one of the things that that this paper argues is that with expertise, there is increased effortlessness in the acquisition of those skills. The skills are displayed in an effortless way, and that may actually coincide with, there may be some transient increase in certain areas of the brain, but then they may retract over time as expertise develops. So it may be that at a certain developmental period in our practice, increased gray matter in particular regions may be helpful, but with the development of expertise, it then begins to recede. So that's a little bit of the current evidence, but let me just offer one other caveat, and that is with respect to another structural type change, and that is white matter connectivity. I've been talking about gray matter and the increased volume of certain regions of the brain, like in the prefrontal cortex. Those have been referring to gray matter. White matter, as I mentioned, is the connections among regions of the brain. And there are a few things to say here. One is that it appears from all of the evidence, not just from meditation, but looking at the acquisition of other kinds of skills. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. But it seems like white matter changes are much more sensitive to environmental and behavioral factors than are gray matter changes. So one example, for example, is the learning of a complex visual motor skill. One visual motor skill that's been studied is juggling. And there are data that show that 1.5 hours of a juggling lesson in beginning jugglers is associated with white matter changes in the brain. 1.5 hours. And so you can see these structural changes very, very quickly, but it doesn't mean that they're going to last. And it's very dynamic. And so if you don't continue to juggle, those white matter changes would likely recede. But we've published data showing that there are white matter changes, and this is in the same data set where we showed that there are no gray matter changes, but we see white matter changes in pathways that are really important for self-regulation, with just, maybe 20 to 30 hours of practice. And we have very new data that are not yet published with our Healthy Minds program showing that 5 minutes a day approximately for 30 days, for a month, is also associated with white matter changes in the brain. So there may well be these connectivity changes that we can see very early on, and these connectivity changes may really be important and are very different in nature than the gray matter changes that were initially hyped in the early literature on the brain and meditation.
This is super interesting, Richie. Let me see if I can bring this back to just some of kind of the more everyday understanding of this. I mean, two things that I hear you saying, and we kind of kick this whole thing off with a distinction between measuring the way the brain functions, like essentially what regions and networks of the brain are more or less active at any given point in time, is one thing we can measure, and one way we could talk about the brain changing, so to speak. Another thing is the actual physical structure of the brain changing. And you've brought up both white matter and gray matter, and which are two different elements and two different things that we can measure. And one of the things that I'm hearing here, which I think is really interesting, is that some of the hype and some of the headlines, as you mentioned, were, meditation grows your brain, or it's basically increasing brain volume in certain regions and certain areas. And I think what you're pointing to is that, one, the science at best is mixed, and in certain cases seems to have been overblown and is controversial, clearly. But more importantly, it's not even clear that that's a good thing, that you would want that to happen or expect that to happen. And again, the analogy we often give when we talk about meditation is to think about it in relationship to the brain, like we think of the physical body and physical exercise. And there's something very similar there. You wouldn't, if you were exercising, the first thing I think you could say is, you probably would expect some increase in muscle mass, especially if you've never exercised. But it certainly would not be a linear thing, like you just keep exercising and it just goes up, 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 and up. nor would you want it to do that. You probably want a little bit of that in some cases, especially if there's a deficit. In some cases, you might not want any increase in muscle mass. But there's all sorts of interesting things that you do want that have nothing to do with just how big, for example, your muscles are. And it felt like we have this very simplistic way of thinking about the brain, like, oh, you meditate and then you just want it to get bigger and bigger or something, which clearly it's much more about the relationship between different brain networks and brain regions. And I think that's what you're showing is sometimes the connections between them might, that might be increasing. You might want increased efficiency. We often talk about the expert meditators you just mentioned who, this U-shaped curve that we've seen with attentional networks where the true experts expend very little energy and you might not see some dramatically different brain structure, but somehow the efficiency, the way with which their brain is operating is very different. Much like, a marathon runner could just hop off the couch and just go jog for a few miles and it would be nothing relative, to a typical person, say. So the story is just more complicated. And I think that often seems to be the take-home message. We've talked about this with dopamine. We've talked about it with the amygdala. We've talked about it with different things about the brain where there's this kind of simplistic story as though something is good and bad, when really it's actually much more nuanced than that. So maybe we could wrap this up. This is another one where we're probably going to have many different conversations. How do you think the normal person should think about this and look at this, like from a more everyday point of view? Like what should we be aiming for in terms of brain health, I guess you could say, and how a practice like meditation would be helping in that regard?
Yeah, so there are a few things to say, and one new thing to say here that I did not talk about earlier, but your question prompts it, Court. There are many factors in the brain. Obviously, the brain is so enormously complicated. But one factor that we haven't talked about is inflammation in the brain. We know that inflammation can occur in the body, and many chronic illnesses are associated with inflammation, autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular diseases, many different kinds. And we know that many forms of meditation in general have an anti-inflammatory effect. And that's also true, it seems. This is, I really should be careful about my words here. This is likely the case in the brain as well, that there is anti-inflammatory effects in the brain. We do know that inflammation occurs in the brain, and that neuroinflammation is a contributory cause to premature neurodegeneration and to various types of dementia. And so this is super important in terms of brain health. And we're beginning to develop non-invasive ways of measuring neuroinflammation in humans with MRI. It's just beginning now. So it's going to be an exciting next few years in that space. But so to get back to your question about, what can we really take from this? There are a few things. One is there's no question that meditation changes the brain. And then here we're talking about both the function and the structure of the brain. There's no question. Meditation does change the brain. And there is overwhelming evidence for that. And so we know that simply intentionally deploying our mind in the many ways we can in the various kinds of meditation that we've talked about in Dharma Lab do change the brain. Whether those changes are purely functional or include some structural changes, many of those technical details are still being adjudicated in scientific research, and that's exciting. And we're going to learn more. But one of the things that the Dalai Lama told me many years ago after we started doing research on meditation and beginning to see changes in the brain, he actually said that he thinks about this. He reflects on this when he's meditating on many days, thinking that it's kind of remarkable that his brain is changing as a consequence of his meditation. And that's something that we all can embrace. It's super cool that this is the case. It didn't, it was not necessarily the case that this was going to be this way. And the evidence is overwhelming that this is true. I think that, even the most skeptical scientist would agree that the evidence is showing that the brain changes in some ways. And so that's good news. And it means that we have a huge amount of potential to transform ourselves. And I would go so far as to say that there's very good evidence to suggest that humans have the capability for transforming their brain in a way that is far greater than any other species. And so we're given this precious gift. And so the invitation in all that we're talking about in Dharma Lab is let's harness this gift for the good.
What a wonderful message. So I think it's gets at some of the nuance and such a hopeful view of the brain rather than I think the way we often feel and the way what the science was pointing to many decades ago, which it kind of felt like we're just sort of hardwired a certain way and there's not a lot of room for change. I think what you're suggesting is that actually there's a tremendous amount of change, and even our biology, our brains are wired for change and transformation to some degree. So such a hopeful view. So Richie, this is yet another topic that I'm sure we're going to be revisiting as new science comes out. We actually have papers, as you mentioned and alluded to, that will be coming out in the not too distant future that speak to this very topic. So I'm sure we will be revisiting it sometime soon. But thank you, Richie, for another great conversation. And really, especially thank you for all the science. I mean, you have been leading the charge, publishing some of the most pioneering research in this area that's helping us better understand how this actually works. So thank you. And for everybody watching, thank you for joining. And we'll see you soon for another episode of Dharma Lab.
Thank you so much.